All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk. It's called I Think I Need a Writer, Tools for Troubleshooting Narrative with me, your host, JoJo. Okay, so you probably chose to come to this talk for at least one of the following reasons. You are a dev making a game and you need help with the writing, either through hiring a writer or upskilling yourself. You are a writer who has started, is about to start, or wants to start working on the IP of others. You're a GCAP with a vague interest in this topic and have a free 50 minutes. Anyway, whatever reason, thank you. There actually is a fourth reason, and that is you're one of my colleagues and you came here to support me. Thank you so much. Okay, to get it out of the way in case anyone wants to awkwardly shuffle out the back, no harm, no foul, I'll just go over what we're going to be doing today. So we're going to be looking at how to strengthen narrative through writing by understanding the meaning of your game. It's going to be aimed at games that are not narrative-driven, and I'm defining narrative-driven here as a game that relies primarily on its authored story for audience appeal. If you are making a narrative or story-driven game, presumably your narrative has already been developed concurrently with your game, and you have someone on your team for that. It's going to be heavily focused on the process and craft of bringing together artistic collaborators to better understand story. I'd like to say that this is called Tools for Troubleshooting Narrative because I wanted to have a hooky title, but it's not actually going to be about any kind of plugin or software. You are the tool. Who am I? My name is JoJo. I am a writer, dramaturg, and narrative designer. I'm the head of narrative at Massive Monster working on Cult of the Lamb, first released in 2022. I was a writer on Dragon Bears Enchanted, released 2023, and I've worked as a freelance writer and dramaturg, more on that in a bit, for 8 years now, across games, theatre, screen, performance arts, installations. If someone was paying me to write it, I was writing it. In October of 2021, 8 months before the release of Cult of the Lamb, Massive Monster asked if I could come on board as a contractor and help with some of the writing. Sure, I said, why not? I didn't yet have an understanding of the timelines of game development, and I came from an industry in which the script was the originator of everything that came afterwards. So it was quite a shock to me when I came on board to this almost done, beautifully realized game, and they didn't know exactly how it ended yet. In October of 2022, 5 months before the release of Enchanted, Dragon Bear were looking for, at the time, a script editor to help get their text ready for localization. Again, I came on board to a project where pretty much everything was locked down except for the writing. So I wanted to do this talk as a product of my own experience, but also speaking to other writers. I realized that it's not an uncommon occurrence in the indies game industry for writers to be brought on quite late into development. Is this ideal? I think it's fair to say maybe not. The longer you wait to worry about the writing, the harder it will be to get good writing into your game. But I also understand that indie budgets are really, really tight. When I asked the director that I work with what pushed them over the edge into hiring a writer, into thinking that they needed a writer, when they had originally planned on doing everything themselves, he said, desperation. And baby, desperate is where I do my best work. So here is our scenario. There is a game. It's almost done, but the story has been lost somewhere along the way. We need to find it again and finish it. How are we going to do that? The process of dramaturgy. So dramaturgy, as defined by when you Google what is dramaturgy, is the theory and practice of dramatic composition. It comes from theatre and is the practice of looking at how every combined theatrical element, text, set, sound, comes together to form an understanding for your audience. So it can also be looked at as the mechanisms of meaning making. This can go by a lot of names: narrative consultant, script doctor, editor, but I like dramaturg better. A dramaturg is someone who assists writers and creatives in understanding and delivering their story by looking at how meaning is being created. So games, theatre, film, TV are all storytelling, and each has a dramatic composition. Your game is dramatic. Your narrative, art, level design, systems, UI, they lend themselves to the creation of drama, a contained world that enables the player through action to tell their story. And stories are most effectively told when each of its constituent parts work together. So I'm going to step through some helpful processes, questions, and topics that are designed to get existing dev teams and new writers on the same page, building the same story. If you are a dev looking to improve your own storytelling in your game without an external writer, these tools for troubleshooting narrative can be used on yourself. I'm going to start by saying that the usual disclaimer, creativity is not prescriptive. This is the way I think about the work I do, and I hope that some of it's useful to you. And while I'll talk about some common narrative rules, there will always be exceptions to them, especially since games can be so varied. Subversion can make your story surprising, memorable, and unique. I would just say that if you're going to be the exception on purpose. All right, starting at the start, why is narrative important? To premeditate your question of, is this talk just going to be a series of questions and definitions? Kind of. A key to effective artistic collaboration is creating a shared language. Words can be slippery things. If I say water, am I thinking about a beach while you're thinking about a river? If we can align ourselves, we can move toward the same goal together. So why is narrative important? Narrative adds meaning to your game. It does so by motivating players. That's an easy one. Like I just mentioned about you and me aligning ourselves so we can move toward the same goal together, aligning players with playable characters' motivations means the momentum of your story will carry them through. Narrative fuels the wants of your player. It sparks their engine. Narrative contextualizes gameplay. It influences how players learn to play the game and lightens the player's cognitive load by connecting their actions to their understanding of the world, so you can be alleviated of the burden of explaining everything to your player. When I play Dave the Diver, you don't really have to explain to me that I need to manage Dave's oxygen, because I understand that that's what divers need. In Pokemon, I know that water types will beat fire types, because water puts out fire. I don't need these things to be overtly explained to me. What a relief. And narrative is happening anyway. Storytelling is innate to humans. We're wired to recognize patterns, to interpret meaning, to make little stories out of our lives and the things we see and do. We just can't help it. So even if you don't consciously intend it, players are making a story out of your game. Make it one that you want to tell. And what isn't narrative? Narrative is not just words, which I feel can be a common misconception in the game space. Games are not just textual experiences. They are audio experiences, tactile and mechanical experiences, visual experiences. For the purposes of this talk, we're assuming that those experiences have already been established, and we're looking at how words can support, emphasize, and complement them. So back to our scenario. There is a game, it's almost done, but the story has been lost somewhere along the way. We need to find it again and finish it. You've hired, or you are, a writer. What first? So this first stage I like to call running diagnostics, to just keep up with the overarching metaphor that I'm going for here. We are going to look at what story your game is already telling and how effective that is. We're finding the problem so that we can fix it. So the first thing you need to do is hand it over. To efficiently onboard a writer, here's some things that you could do in preparation. None of these are really going to blow anyone's minds. Let them play the build. Let them form an impression. First impressions are incredibly useful because they will never be more closely aligned to the player than they are now, and you can only get someone's first impression once. Often when we've been working for something for a long time, we can't see the forest for the trees, so utilize this opportunity. Hand over existing documentation, pitch deck, game design doc, character sheets, marketing beats, even things you think won't be useful. Let them decide that. And think of some solid narrative reference points, which you'll probably have already. It's really helpful when you're specific about the things you want to emulate from these games. Don't just say, I want to make it like Dredge. Say that I want to create the sense of eternal dread that you feel playing Dredge. Like there's always something beneath the surface and it's worse. And use game and non-game media as narrative references, because game genre and story genre can be easily confused. And reference your own work. If there's something you really like, use it as an exemplar. Ain't nothing wrong with it. All right, so writers. We're looking at what story is already being told by considering each part of the game and how they work together to create meaning. We're going to be looking at the premise, mechanics, art, UI, and writing. All right, the premise. The premise is often the most developed part of the narrative because the premise is what you pitch, and more players start games than finish them. So a lot of effort is put into that setup. So what is being set up? Keep an eye on that premise over the course of the game and how it manifests and evolves in all the following ways. This is the premise of Cult of the Lamb, that you're a little lamb who has been killed and brought back to serve a dark god. Mechanics. At GCAP last year, Samara Jade Sendek gave an amazing talk called Yes, There is Subtext. It's called Mechanics. And it's exactly what it sounds like. The mechanics of your game is the subtext of your story. We've all heard the age-old adage, show, don't tell. And while that certainly applies to games, we also get access to another one, do, don't tell. So what are players being asked to do? What tools are you giving them to navigate the world you've placed them in? Enchanted is a cozy co-op game in which you and your friends work in an inn, making potions and food to serve customers, and by doing so, building community and identity. What you do is work together for the greater good. So that's the subtext, the underlying theme of the game. You can't ask players to work together for the greater good and then give them a narrative that pits them against each other, because it won't match the action. And because what the characters do is working together, their characterization is built around it. They have varying motivations why they want to help or why they don't. And the antagonist is trying to stop them from doing that. He wants to tear them apart. Mechanics inform narrative reasoning. Cult of the Lamb has two main mechanical languages, base building and dungeon crawling, caring and killing. Two pretty extreme ends of the spectrum, placed right next to each other. This told me a couple of things. That the language of the world can likewise operate in extremes, from playful to sinister, and it won't feel jarring because it matches the player's actions. And that we're working with the binary of good, which we associate with caring, and bad, which we associate with killing. So this world is preoccupied with moral issues, and we can present the player with a narrative that pushes them to one side or the other, or, even better, play in the space between them. All right, art. Characters, creatures, environments, what have you. All games involve world building because you are presenting a fictionalized version of the world no matter what. Art is one of the greatest expressions of world building your game has to offer. Your writing should add to or strengthen offers found in the art. I will say, don't double up on your beats. Back to show, don't tell. If the player can see it, they don't need to read it. Leave the lore building to the art. Add text when it offers something new and necessary. This can vary from picking up on design motifs and set pieces to deepen lore or make jokes, to articulating core themes into text. The world of Cult of the Lamb is inhabited by animals, and it's about cults. When I joined, something that struck me the most was the idea that animals exist in a hierarchy, and so does organized religion. So natural and divine laws melded together, creating the backbone of the world's logic and laws, and dramatically shaping the world building. And while I was the one to articulate it, that theme already existed in the game because my colleagues are storytellers. They just do it visually while I do it textually. Art style is also deeply related to writing tone. Enchanted's art style is cute, with big anime influences. That style organically lends itself to sincerity and earnestness. These characters, they're not going to swear unless it's a deliberate subversion of expectation. But they're also not going to make highbrow cerebral arguments. They can speak from the heart, and it's sappy and sentimental, and it fits because of how the game looks. We expect that of those characters. All right, there is a lot to say about UI, but I'm going to focus on dialogue UI and the things like quest logs and journal entries. So dialogue UI directly impacts how dialogue can be created and is received. Form shapes content and vice versa. For one, it comes with constraints to line length, which affects the pacing and rhythm of those lines. So how can you craft dialogue to make the best use of its form? So one of my biggest pet peeves actually in text for games is when you're reading any kind of text and you click to the next page and there's just one or two words there hanging on. I think a good key to that, especially in dialogue, is to break up your text line in a way that mimics conversation. This way you integrate the click of the player hitting next into the flow of this interaction or story. This rhythm can also be used to tell us more about a character. Short sentences, run-on sentences, one word per string or 50. You can also use font size and text effects if you can to keep things dynamic and strengthen characterization. So Hecate, one of our characters, the frog lady in the middle there, her backstory is that she has a throat injury that affects the way that she can speak. So her dialogue is always in a smaller text and has a persistent wiggle effect. That's how you can integrate those aspects of character backstory into the way text is presented. The dialogue UI in Cults is also something that appears above characters in a speech bubble manner. It is static regardless of who is speaking. And so after a while, it can kind of feel interchangeable. I try to compensate for this by making character voice incredibly strong and unique. I ask myself, even if the player couldn't see the character speaking, would they be able to tell who it is anyway? And then, of course, things like maps, quest logs, and journal entries are valuable space for lore building and supplementary story delivery. These spaces are out of the action. They don't have the pressure of progression on them. They're generally engaged with at the player's leisure, so as long as you don't bury any key information, you're welcome to be more verbose there. Generally, this is where your story can go. The history, the details, those great little flavors and facts, but not your narrative. And writing. What is the existing writing doing in the game, and how effectively is it doing that? I don't want to imply that bringing on board a writer should involve a complete overhaul of all your game's text. Work with the examples that already exist. Is the writing sparse, a workhorse there to direct player from A to B? Or is it abundant, flowery, and flavorful? Does it reference the world it exists in? And what are the established voices, both character and game? So while you're analysing this, we're using the tool of reflection. Reflect on what is drawing you in and what's pulling you out. What's working really well together? What creates that sense of immersion and what breaks it? When are you left with too many questions and not enough answers? Make sure you note them because you are the best litmus test for what is working and what is not. And keep pacing in mind, the distribution of the story throughout the game. There's so much to say about pacing, but it's out of the scope of this talk, Okay, so we've looked at the story that's already been told via the premise, mechanics, art, UI, and writing. These questions will help you determine that. Now, what story do you want to tell? Let's figure that out by coming together and having a yarn. So, the first meeting between the director, directors, and writer. The goal of it should be to understand the full vision of the game and create a shared collaborative language by asking some more questions. All right, first up, what happens? Straight to the point. We're talking about the plot, the chain of events that play out through the game. Having the director articulate the plot of their game back to you is a really powerful tool for figuring out what's working and what's not, because it will show you what's memorable and what's forgettable. And why? If you start wandering into, and then somehow, and then for some reason, you know that that area needs some elbow grease. Writers are often in charge of the whys, coming up with backstory, linking beats together. Even if the reason doesn't need to be manifested in the game itself, the creators should have an understanding of how things work. What is sacred? What are the most important bits, the non-negotiables narratively? These can be ideas or characters or sequences of action. What is untouchable, lest you lose the soul of your game? This is just a really great quote from a writer called Sarah Rule, who talks about, be wary of the person who comes in telling you to cut, 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 because the soul of your game might accidentally live there. And why did you want to make it? Some may find this question superfluous, but this question is designed to understand the intentions behind creative choices. For Enchanted, they wanted to make a game that explored colonisation and reclamation in the context of Australia's history and treatment of its Indigenous peoples. This desire informed every narrative choice that was made and hugely guided the writing I did. Also, call me touchy-feely, but games as a piece of creation will always contain the personalities of the people who make them. Understanding the people who make the game will help you understand the game better. And how do you want players to feel? I think this is one that will be familiar to everyone in the room. Games are art. Art is about the communication of emotion. What response do you want to provoke in your players? What is that feeling that you're trying to get them to feel? Otherwise, why would they keep playing it? And this is the big one I did all that groundwork to get to, really. What is the heart of your game? All the other questions should help you in getting to this point if you don't know the answer already. What is the thing that it's all about? Where all roads lead back to, the center of your game's gravity. Sorry for all my mixed metaphors there. Identifying that one thing means that whenever you get really stuck, you can always come back to this. Turn to the game loop. This encompasses your narrative as well. The heart of Cult of the Lamb is, you'll never guess, cults. In gameplay, all actions are done with the intention of growing your cult, which gives you more power so you can continue to grow your cult. But how does that encompass the narrative? Cult of the Lamb is about cults. Cults are about belonging and about power. Each major character and each major beat contributes back towards those ideas. Throughout the game, the player gathers power and uses it to create or reject a sense of belonging for their followers. And every major character we meet is either motivated by belonging or by power, because that's the world of cults. But how can these concepts be turned into an active and actionable thing? You'll never guess. It's more questions! So one of Australia's great playwrights, Alana Valentine, says that at the heart of every play is an unanswerable question. I think this applies to games as well. In writing, we call this the dramatic question. Pursuit of the answer feeds and creates drama. In games, the pursuit of this answer creates gameplay. The Last of Us Part 1 is a really easy example of a well-executed dramatic question. It asks us, what would you do for love? Throughout the game, we see this play out again and again in the story and the mechanics, from characters who have abandoned the notion of love completely and would therefore do nothing for it, and characters who would do anything for love, including doomed humanity. But that's a AAA narrative-driven. What? That's not applicable to us. I hear you cry. Yes, I hear you. Let's look at Celeste. Celeste asks, how do you overcome an obstacle when the obstacle is you, as you scale a mountain pursued by yourself? Stardew Valley asks, how do you live a fulfilling life as you leave behind the rat race to fix up an old abandoned farm? Unpacking asks, who do you want to be as you unpack your various houses over the course of a life, meeting yourself over and over and over again? The heart of Cult of the Lamb is the cult, and cults are about belonging and power. So the dramatic question is, what would you do with power? Players answer this question in multiple ways over and over again as they exert their power to befriend, tend, manipulate, and slaughter. Side quests are informed by the power dynamics between the player and NPCs, and antagonists are those who would challenge their power. Keep in mind that these are unanswerable questions, and in making your game, you are not providing answers. You're offering ideas and the space to explore them. Okay. Whew. So now we have determined the story the game is currently telling and the story you want it to tell. Do any of these answers work against each other? Is the director saying one thing, but the game is saying another? That's how you find your problem. But always be honest about what you think your writing can fix. Writing isn't waving a magic wand and a narrative appears. You're limited by what you have, and sometimes you can't turn the thing you have into the thing you want. Work with the director to pivot the narrative vision towards something you are already doing well. And if you can't, then all you can do is your best with what you've got. Okay, and these are just, again, more questions. These are practical ones. I'm just going to blitz through them because your writer is going to need to know them, to know the answer of them, to help troubleshoot and solve your problem. So what is fixed and what is flexible? When time is precious, you don't want to spend it working on something that's going to be impossible to implement. And we're looking for any available space to help remedy narrative problems. In Cult of the Lamb, item descriptions. That was an easy free space for me to build story and lore. In Enchanted, they actually had interactions that they were just not using at all where characters could appear if I requested them to. And that was just the major and main way that I was able to solve narrative problems. The nitty-gritty, just simple things. What is the rating of the game? American or British English, which a lot of people forget to ask. Big no-nos. Big no-nos can be anything. For Enchanted, we were led by a cultural consultant to ensure that we engaged with the topic as respectfully as possible. For Cult of the Lamb, big no-nos involve explicitly referencing Christian terms, which seems ironic, like heaven and hell, or use of the word magic. And is it getting localized? Just let them know at the start. Localization is a huge process, and while it doesn't necessarily inform the story content in its original language, it might change it once it is translated. So let them know if they're getting localized. It also adds constraints to character limit per string, and they can help you. Okay, I don't know why I picked this picture. I was just Google imaging Cult of the Lamb, and this one was very popular. Alrighty, so we've covered how to understand the way meaning is made in your game, how to figure out what you want your game to mean. Let's take a look at using Cult of the Lamb as a specific example. Obviously, all games are different, and each process comes with its own challenges. But for now, let's do a case study. All right. So I had played the build a bit, seen the art, reviewed my references, and had a chat with the directors about the vibe they were going for Cult of the Lamb and what space was available to deliver narrative. And while some useful examples already existed, there were masses of text yet to be generated for Cult, mostly for inventory, and they wanted to add flavors of the world into it. So start small. That's not going to blow anyone's mind. Start small, start generating, and write to discover and explore. So they had said they wanted to add flavors of the world into these textual examples wherever they could, strengthening the sense of the poetic and the mysterious, which were two of my feeling words for tone as I started on item and weapon descriptions. The third being biblical, which isn't really a feeling, but I think it really is quite evocative, so it suited perfectly. I wrote a suite of item descriptions, really just playing with tone and things that I thought would fit or that we would like. And one of the directors, who I am just going to go ahead and call Jay as a time saver, picked examples that he really liked and ones that were not quite right and gave feedback. All right, let's talk quickly about feedback for writing, especially if you've never worked with a writer before. When giving feedback on writing or when examining or analysing it, there's a couple of helpful rules. Again, a given, specificity. This goes for any kind of feedback, really. Be specific about what is or isn't working. Saying that you don't like something or that it's not very good is not productive feedback. You can't action that. And then, this might not come naturally to some devs, but talk to your writers in feelings. They'll understand because writing is pretty much codifying and provoking feeling and imagination. Be specific about the kinds of feelings you want to evoke. Suspense, passion, anger. And if the wrong ones are being evoked, then what are those? So in this example, Jay highlighted these as a good direction to move in. Descriptions that were flowery and employed heavy use of metaphor, and especially this weapon description. This one was revelatory for me because I realized that actually what they were after was strong world-building offers. Which brings me to intention. Always go back to intention. If something really isn't working, go back to the intended purpose and feeling of that line, encounter, or scene and work it. Understanding intention is the most useful thing you can do to equip a writer to be able to work independently and consistently. Different parts of the game will have different intentions. Is this for world building, foreshadowing, humor, or pace? General vibes, which I think is a perfectly suitable intention. But knowing the intention is what will guide you as you write. Okay. Case study, Cult of the Lamb. So we had found the problem. The world needed more depth and ways to connect. The solutions? We wanted to capitalize on offers that already exist in the game, and we need to identify space to do so. I'd kind of found my feet for Cult of the Lamb, so what next? I got my hands on the NPC dialogue, some of which was in its final form and much of which was placeholder. I worked up from side characters to key beats. I drew what I could from the writing that had already been done, and I drew hugely from the art. The world of Cult of the Lamb is visually rich and detailed, and I take absolutely zero credit for that. It has heaps of points of interest available for me to draw story from. We rewrote existing strings to make characters acknowledge their settings, major events, other characters, their beliefs and their fears, things that connected them to the world they lived in, creating a network of cause and effect. And we were able to strengthen narrative stakes by clarifying and communicating character goals and motivations. And also by referencing things beyond the player's experience so the world felt alive. We additionally had space to add small interactions and encounters, low-scope Easter eggs that players could ferret out to satisfy their curiosity, making them feel like they really were discovering the world. Alrighty, so the problem, the world needed more depth and connection. The solutions we had found was capitalizing on offers that already exist in the game, identifying space to connect ideas, having characters acknowledge the world they live in through references, and referencing things that beyond the player's experience to make the world feel alive. But wait, there's more. All right, there was one particular side quest the directors had asked me if I could script. They had all of the relevant game information in place. They knew who the character involved was, and they knew what the player would get as a reward. That it would be over 4 separate but linear encounters at hub locations stretching across the entirety of the game. So they knew the what and the why in a gameplay sense, but not in a narrative one. That's my job. So I asked myself, what happens and why? What is the action, the thing that changes here? Why is it happening? All right, well, you can counter the fox and you give them something and then he gives you something. It's all very classic questy. Why? I don't really know yet. What is sacred? What do we need to preserve in this moment? Narratively, nothing. Great, kind of easy, blank slate, but also scary. Why did you want to make it? What purpose is it fulfilling? Okay, so it's there so that the player can get a thing that they don't really need, but they want, and they probably actually want it quite badly. So that's a good motivation. That's good incentive. How do you want players to feel? So this I knew the answer to because it had cropped up again and again in various conversations over various things. Confronted, morally conflicted, ethically icky. And how does it answer our dramatic question? What does it offer to the heart of our game? Our dramatic question is, what would you do with power? So how can we search for answers here? I didn't have an answer to all of them, but I really only needed the answer to one or two to get me going, and I had them. And so I went back, looked at the questions again. Okay, so we want the players to feel confronted, ethically icky, morally ambiguous. Great. Sacrifice is a mechanic that we have in the game, and it suits perfectly the tone that we're going for in this quest. So let's use that. Here's what we ended up with. The first encounter, that character, the fox, asks for some fish. At that point, a resource the player has access to and an easy decision to make. The next time, he asks for one of the player's followers in return. No big deal. Players at this point are generally comfortable sacrificing their followers. The third time, more than a yes or no choice. You can give the fox 2 of your followers or permanently give up some of your health. The player's use of power becomes more complex here. But in the final encounter, the player is asked to sacrifice a beloved NPC, their mentor throughout the game. This choice, it really only has slight gameplay stakes, but it has big narrative ones. If you don't do it, your mentor lives, but you don't get the reward. You do it, and your mentor dies, and you get that shiny thing you're after. But on the level of the meta story, you have to do it to get 100% completion. So in this confronting choice, what would the player do with their power? Well, it's up to them in the end. This side quest ended up becoming one of the most memorable things about the game, generating a lot of online engagement. And I think it's because it doesn't just simply and effectively encapsulate the ideas at the heart of cults and our dramatic question, but it pushes that question beyond the contained world of the game directly into the hands of the players. And players generally understood this. Okay, the journey so far. We have looked at how to find narrative problems by understanding the story we want our game to tell. There's a text missing there, but we've understood the story we want our game to tell, the story it's already telling, and the unanswerable question. We've talked about feedback for writing and focusing on specificity, feeling, and intention. And we've looked at a case study for identifying problems and finding solutions. There's that text that wasn't there before. Guys, making slides is really hard. Okay, but of course, every project and every process is unique. The way that you find these unique answers to your unique problems is by asking questions. I wish that I could give you a cheat sheet for how to fix everything that's going wrong, but really, there is no one answer. You have to go searching for it yourself. But you need to understand these answers must be guided by gameplay. Changing the narrative can change the meaning of actions. It can alter the player's motivation or perception or understanding, but the actions, the mechanics, the loop remain the same. So the player response to this change in meaning needs to be able to manifest in the set actions of your game. When presenting the player with new narrative obstacles, they must have the means of overcoming them. So the midpoint in the narrative of Cult of the Lamb, which is the kind of point where all is lost and the hero must recover, is when the player confronts Shimura, generally the fourth boss they fight, but not always. Shimura essentially tells the lamb that if Shimura is killed at their hand, or hoof, I guess, and the big bad Narinda is released, which is the player's initial objective, then the lamb is certain to be killed by him. After this point, the gameplay action is the same as we've known it. Care for your cult, hack and slash those who'd stop you. But the meaning of that action has changed. Our target enemy and understanding of the lamb's circumstance has changed. Still, they have the means to overcome it through gameplay. And always remember when you are that you are creating an experience for other people. So what do you want your game experience to be? Go back to the heart of your game, the dramatic question. What is not the answer, but your answer? Whoop. Enchanted didn't have a fleshed out narrative ending when I joined, which was an interesting challenge because the finishing cutscene had been animated and was done and could only, again, be changed textually. The cultural consultant, the director, and I threw around a lot of options, but we kept coming back to, what do we want people to take away from this? So the bad guy, whose name is Colin Isa, has been defeated and in the final level, but the narrative wasn't yet resolved. We talked about the elders beating him up and sending him running and what that said, that sometimes violence is the answer. But that didn't feel right. It didn't feed into a game where the heart of it is working together. Something that came up from the cultural consultant was the cultural importance and power of song and music. The dramatic question of Enchanted is, how do you reclaim something that has been taken from you? The answer we put forward, by building community and claiming identity. And that was expressed through the metaphor of music, with the force of their collective song, the unifying expression of their culture and identity, which banished evil. So games can be so beautifully nonlinear, and different parts of games can answer different questions. But I'm going to simplify it for now. Celeste ends with the main character and their antagonist, a dark version of themselves, working together to climb the mountain. If their question is, how do you overcome obstacles when the obstacle is you? Their answer is, by accepting every part of yourself. Stardew Valley asks, how do you live a fulfilling life? Their answer is, you do the things that makes you happy. In Cult, we ask, what would you do with power? And we say, whatever your conscience allows. So here is our scenario. There is a game. It's almost done, and it turns out the story was never lost. It was just buried. We've uncovered it again by understanding what is creating meaning in our game and doing it on purpose. Finding the unanswerable question at the heart. Using the writing of our game to strengthen, connect, and contrast themes and ideas. And focusing on feeling. There are two more things that I want to add before we go. The story is already there. The work has already started. This talk was dense, and I'm sure a little overwhelming, but I want to assure you that you already know what you're doing. A story getting lost can be discovered again with some thought. This whole process is about making an unconscious process a conscious one, and articulating and identifying what you already know so you can communicate it better to your collaborators and your players. And there is no right answer. Sometimes looking at the mechanics of writing or creativity can make people feel like some kind of right answer exists, but it doesn't. You're telling the story that you want to tell and making the experience you want to make. That's all that anyone can really do. Thanks. Special thanks to the people there who let me interview them as I prepared for this talk. And if anyone has questions, bada bing, bada boom. Great. If you have a question, please come up to one of the mics. The facilitators asked me to ask people to do that.
What's your favorite item description in Cult of the Lamb?
Oh, that's a tough one. It probably is the one that I showed, which is the godly axe, I think, the blade that was used to sever the lands of the old faith from the wider world. It was just like such a moment for me where I was like, oh, we're actually building out this world. Like we're trying to connect these ideas together and make something big. Into the mic, please.
Would you argue that a game that has a sad and terrible ending could elicit more emotion than a game that has a good ending and a positive outcome?
I think that is a difficult question because how do you quantify more emotion? And how do you weigh joy against sadness? I think that we, as people, generally, despite the nihilism that does run rampant, we do want to feel happy and joyful about the world. And that's really reflected in the stories that we tell. Many of them do have happy, quote unquote, endings. So that means that when sad or upsetting endings come along, they are very memorable. But I don't know if anyone could ever answer which one has more meaning or impact. No worries.
Hello.
Hi.
You mentioned that, unfortunately, in most scenarios, you end up coming in at the end of a project, or writers in general come in at the very end because everything's already locked in, they don't have much money. In the sort of ideal scenario that you're brought in earlier, but it's still the sort of, that's not like they have enough to pay you full time for the whole development, but they can bring you in for a little bit way towards the beginning. What are the sort of like what is the ideal situation that you come into in that scenario in terms of what's already there? Like what does a team that's already prepared look like in the ideal scenario?
I mean, as always, it's going to vary depending on the project. But I think this process that I just outlined is a reflective one and not a generative one. So this all depends on the fact that something exists to examine and strengthen meaning out of. I think in an ideal world, it's not a bad idea for a writer to be brought in like a bit earlier, even if it's not like a consistent contract, but just like 1 or 2 or a week of story narrative development to help, I guess, the game devs articulate and understand what they want to be doing and the story they want to be telling. But really, games writing varies so much because it can be really flexible and it can be really reactive. And so I think it just depends on whether, as you're making the game, you actually know what you want to be saying. If you don't, maybe bring someone in to help.
Just as a follow-up to that part, while you brought onto a project, has there ever been a case where we've gone onto a project and we've had to look at the story the narrative as a whole and decide something's not working and we have to change enough stuff to make it work? Has that ever happened?
I've definitely, like the 2 games projects that I outline here, they were never unworkable. There was always something that could be done. There were definitely, I think, and looking at like Enchanted, big pivots that had to be made. But I think it goes back to what I said of, you need to, especially late in development, look at what you're doing well already. You can't just push it towards what you hope and idealize that it will be. You have to be practical and say, what is the meaning that's already been created? And just work and lean into that, if that kind of answers the question. Hey, Julian.
Hey. So when you're coming onto a team and you're suggesting new ideas in terms of narrative to a team that's already been working on it for quite some time, how do you deal with sometimes team members who aren't quite on board or don't quite understand so much what you're pitching to them, as they might not have the narrative background that you have?
That is an excellent question. Thank you so much for asking, because I had like a whole section in this that I had to cut out because I was way over time. I think it's like a tried and true just reality of game development that writers have really specific skill sets, background and training, and a lot of game devs don't have that. I think if you just have to keep the discourse going and you have to figure out ways to re-articulate ideas to each other until it makes sense. And I think the harshest truth of that is being able to recognize when that has become unproductive. So, say the directors have made their case for something and I've said, I don't know if that's going to work. Here is my case. We go back and forth, just trying to shape it into something that works, which is not always necessarily a middle point, because we're not looking for the perfect compromise. We're looking for the best idea. And so you just have to be able to call it when neither of you can say anything new, when you can bring nothing new to the table, somebody's just going to have to call the shots about it. But I think it is building that shared language and just keep chasing the whys and the whys and the whys. Why do you believe that? Okay, well then why do you believe that? And going back towards intention. And if those things don't match, someone's just going to have to make a decision.
So I have a question about games that don't lend themselves as well to narratives. So for instance, racing games. Mm-hmm. Most racing games that have tried to push narratives, strong narratives, usually get bad reviews on the narratives. And the ones that do a smaller amount do better. I'm wondering if you have any opinion or ideas of things that you can do to help the narrative of games that don't specifically lend themselves to it.
I think that is, again, understanding that story is being created regardless. There's like the old kind of saying that even Tetris has a story, and it's a story about creating order out of disorder, or it's a story about humans' pursuit to always put things into neat categories. I guess for games that don't organically lend themselves to narrative. It does go back to the action and the mechanic of it. So just like riffing off here, if I was going to make a racing game, a theme that really appeals to me about that is the nature of winning. That's the first thing that comes first. Doing something the fastest, doing something the best. And so you could take those mechanics which express something about winning and try and build a narrative around that. You could look at, what does it mean to win? What are you willing to give up so you can win? I think it's just making sure that what the player is doing matches the story you want to tell. And in games, because the priority goal is to have a game that is fun to play, the narrative should be something that upholds and supports that.
I guess from like a writer's perspective, when is the point where you've given too much information and you're sort of just overloading the player with like...
Oh my God, yeah, world building to dance, totally. This is such a reflective practice. So you always have to go back to how you feel. There's something I think about all the time with Cult, because I just love story, I love words, I want to push it, but that should never get in the way of the player experience. They should be able to smoothly move through this world and not be held up by like walls of text. If things are getting too dense, there is too much information, I would suggest asking 2 questions. Does the player need to know this? And does this directly impact the state of the world? And if you answer no or not really to both of those questions, you just have to kill your darlings. And also, as I said before, don't double up on your beats. If the art can tell the story for you, you don't need to put it into words.
Thank you for your talk. I just had a question from your experience with games which are inspired and deal with a lot of culture and history. I was wondering, how do you blend fiction and creativity with cultural inspiration and accuracy without stepping on any toes and crossing any lines?
It's always going to be a really fine line to walk, especially if you're telling games that are like particularly culturally informed. A cultural consultant is something that you should ideally budget for and acknowledge. I think it again is chasing the whys. So if you're telling like a culturally significant story or something that speaks to a particular aspect of that culture and want to transfer it into a game, chase the whys behind that. So if we look at kind of Cult as an example again, which invokes a lot of Judeo-Christian like imagery and themes and words and everything like that. It's not really putting that up as like some kind of facade or smokescreen. It's actually looking at why do we love these things? Why do we love religion and why do we love this imagery and these motifs? And the answer we came back to, as expressed before, is that we love a sense of belonging. It's so important to us. And we love a hierarchy of power because it lets us know where we sit in this world. So telling that kind of aspect of that cultural story, we brought it back to what does it kind of say and express about us and our humanity. And then when you have it to its core themes, you can use that to build outwards and upwards.
How do you deal with 2 conflicting sets of rules? For example, a game where you can play through it, reload as many times as you want, and then that same game having a permadeath mode, like from a narrative perspective.
Like lots of games do this in different ways, which is how do you handle death in a game, right? Because players, they want the opportunity and the ability to try again and again and again. Some games, if you're doing like a permadeath mode, that is about high stakes, high risk, high challenge. And maybe that is something that you can integrate into your narrative and say that it is about all those things. It's about just walking on that knife's edge and hoping that you don't fall. And then a game that has infinite replayability, like I think about Celeste in that instance, you die and you are reborn so quickly because the point of it is that you will just keep trying and trying and trying and trying. But I think something new I'd like to add there is that don't underestimate your players. Like players will understand, hopefully, sometimes, often, a mechanical choice. We recently added co-op to Cult of the Lamb, and there was lots of questions about the law and how we justify that and how we can integrate it to the story. And we did to some extent. We gave new facts, new flavor, things to look at. But ultimately, it was a mechanical choice. You want to play with your friend, and players generally understood that because they wanted to play with their friend. And we're pretty much at time, if that's all right. Guys, thank you so much for coming and listening. I really appreciate it.